kind of ashamed and profoundly disappointed, not just on this issue, but on several issues, as to how universities manage to ignore deeply important questions. And after 40 years in the institution, you get to see what those are. Now, 9/11 is really one of the most dramatic cases I've ever seen of this.
Now, my friend Peter Dale Scott talks about deep events. He talks about events which we don't spend too much time trying to understand, that we, in a sense, try not to understand. Events which make a huge impact on the way we live, but we stop thinking about them almost as soon as they happen.
Universities. They are recognized for their research powerhouses, their education, their student life, and their tradition of open discourse on campus. But are there certain lines of inquiry that are considered taboo within universities? Immediately following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, the academic community quickly adopted the official story of that fateful day, as described by the Bush administration, that a group of Arab hijackers led by Osama bin Laden managed to hit precious landmarks without any interference because of intelligence failures on that day. The 9/11 Commission, whose mandate was to provide the fullest possible account of the events of September 11th, also restated this conclusion in their 571-page Commission report. Throughout the years, government officials and the media further reinforced this story, which has served as the foundation of the War on Terror. Academia at large has also maintained this version of events in their curriculum and publications. But have universities critically examined the official story? Is it taboo to do so? Why do several academics identify themselves with this story when they are harsh critics of the U.S. administration's War on Terror? These questions are of crucial importance to a growing number within the academic community.
Here's a transformative event which involves so-called global war on terror, increase in military budgets, a reformulated foreign policy, restrictions of civil rights. So massively important and a watershed event. And what's the university doing? You know, writing some ethereal postmodern critiques of it, but are they asking the basic question, what happened on that day? Who did it? You're not supposed to ask that.
I think it's just considered, oh, we're not going there. It's just not, it's a subject to be avoided, but not, and if you ask people, no, there's no taboo about it. It's just that it's not my area, or it's all too confusing, or who needs it? There's so many other areas that we can critique the establishment on.
It's interesting that in the academy, the case of the invasion of Iraq has received a considerable amount of attention, and that has exposed a considerable number of serious crimes. And yet 9/11 doesn't get the same treatment. 9/11 is still considered out of bounds. I think one of the ways to register the fact that 9/11 is something of a taboo subject in the academy is to look at the scholarship that actually has been published about 9/11. There's been very little examination of the evidence, examination of the 9/11 Commission report.
They have all kinds of stories that they'll embellish the story with, the official story, but they won't criticize it. That tends to be a general path within academia, even among left-wingers, even among very people you would expect to be critical about government stories. This is one government story that's untouchable.
Often, and now I'm speaking specifically of the humanities, often publications that are about 9/11 in some particular way, they work from a presumption, they work from an idea of 9/11 rather than a specific set of evidence. and they certainly don't interrogate those presumptions very much.
The response of many progressive thinkers is best exemplified by Noam Chomsky in his book 9/11, an international bestseller. In a paragraph, Chomsky states, "Evidence about the perpetrators of 9/11 has been hard to find, and long after the source of the anthrax attack was localized to U.S. government weapons laboratories, it has still not been identified. Nevertheless, despite the thin evidence, the initial conclusion about 9/11 is presumably correct."
Academia is by its nature very focused, very specialized, and right away you have, therefore, some blind spots that make it difficult for academics to go beyond a certain area. There's also this notion of society as being very structured and as being created out of structures in which individual action did not have much impact. So for a lot of even Marxist academics or leftist academics, even for them who you expect to be critical of a government story, they're more interested in the broader structural aspects of society. They don't want to look at this thing called September 11th, except obviously in terms of how it's affected society since, but they're not interested in the event itself.
There are a number of recent books in cultural studies, for example, looking at 9/11 in film, in television. These books, you would think, would have to establish some kind of explicit narrative. So when we're talking about 9/11 in film, exactly what are we talking about? But their treatment of the actual gaps in the story, of the ambiguities in the 9/11 Commission report, their treatment of the demonstrable errors in the report or omissions is negligible. So they may spend a few pages in a 200 or 300 page book addressing 9/11 skepticism, and usually it is treated in a kind of dismissive tone.
Last year I decided to go through journals of history, and I said, okay, let's narrow it down to journals of contemporary American history, journals that ought to be dealing to some extent with global war on terror, 9/11, and so on. And I looked at every issue since September 11th, 2001. I did not find a single article that raised the question, who did it? Or is the governmental narrative accurate? You know, they assumed it was accurate. They sometimes questioned what was done in response to it. You know, they were critical of that. There were lots of fancy postmodern, post-colonial articles that were very complicated and sophisticated, you know, reading 9/11 and interpreting 9/11 and 9/11 as narrative, 9/11 as script. But as far as I could tell, there wasn't a single one that actually said what happened on that day. What kind of historian is that? What does it say about the discipline of history right now?
None of the books I can think of make any reference to the many book-length studies of the evidence that have been done by people such as David Ray Griffin. Even if you don't agree with everything in Griffin's analysis, there are parts of it that are undeniably legitimate and deserve to be examined by scholars. So there's clearly an intention there to simply avoid the discussion altogether.
David Ray Griffin, a professor emeritus of the philosophy of religion at Claremont School of Theology, has offered over 30 books, a dozen of which are devoted to exposing contradictions, omissions, and distortions within the 9/11 official story. Despite endorsements from distinguished scholars and former CIA officers, his literature remains unexamined by the larger academic community.
One possible explanation for this broader perception, I think, is what communication scholars call the spiral of silence theory. The spiral of silence addresses this basic question: Are we more willing to express our beliefs when we perceive support for those beliefs, and less willing to disclose them when we think they are not widely shared? So it's about your perception of public opinion and how that perception shapes your willingness to express certain ideas. So the echo chamber of the corporate-controlled media often gives the impression that certain ideas are more widely held than perhaps they are. If you look at the public opinion polls regarding 9/11, there was a global opinion poll done that showed only 46% of respondents believed Al-Qaeda were behind the 9/11 attacks. So you might take from that there's a great deal of misinformation circulating. You might draw a number of conclusions from that, but at the very least, I think it demonstrates that there is a considerable amount of skepticism for whatever reason. So we can't simply proceed from the belief that the dominant opinion is entirely 100% congruent with the official 9/11 Commission report. And therefore, I think there's, at least in part because of that, there is a legitimacy to exploring forms of 9/11 skepticism academically.
When it comes to Al-Qaeda and why most academics seem to accept the official governmental narrative of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and so on, I'm going to be fairly blunt. But first, before I'm blunt, I want to say, look, university professors are very overworked these days. They tend to teach huge numbers of students. They have to publish. They have to do this and that. So many of the reasons why they haven't caught on are quite mundane. They're run off their feet. They're supposed to be specialists in there. They don't have time to just read around. Most of them have read almost nothing on 9/11 because they're too busy doing other things. So there's nothing very complicated there. It's not like they're doing something evil. It's like most people in society. They haven't taken the time or had the time to look into it. Having excused them a little bit in that way, I'm now going to be quite critical. I'm going to say that I think the main reasons they accept the official story are timidity and laziness. Timidity because, it takes a certain intellectual courage to question a story that's being promoted so heavily by almost every government in the world and by the mainstream media and by most academics.
The mainstream media, especially since 9/11, labeled skeptics of official stories as conspiracy theorists in the pejorative sense of the term. The larger academic community has also maintained this approach in its discourse and publications.
And you'd think universities would be smart enough to see through vilification and thought stoppers like conspiracy theory. But for the most part, they don't. They don't. Conspiracies are people getting together to decide how to commit crimes or immoral acts. And moreover, 9/11 was obviously the result of a conspiracy. Somebody conspired. Maybe it was Al-Qaeda, maybe it was somebody else. So it's quite silly to dismiss this as a conspiracy theory. And yet, unreflectively, without thinking about it, they use this. And I even think that the term conspiracy theory works especially well in universities, perhaps even better than outside universities, because university people have a tendency, I'm afraid, towards arrogance, that in other words, people outside the university believe all kind of nutty things. They think Elvis is still alive or UFOs are here or whatever. But we in the university have critical thinking, so we're disciplined thinkers. We would never believe that. So we in the university know that history is a very messy thing. And it's not created by some cabal of people with handlebar mustaches. With all kinds of impersonal forces interacting with other forces and contingencies and accidents and the interaction of personality and institution. But there are in the great unwashed outside the university, some people who want to have a comforting, simplistic view of the universe, think that history unfolds simply through bad people getting together in back rooms and planning it all. And that's the conspiracy theorists. And we, therefore, are above that. And when we call someone a conspiracy theorist, we're not just calling them an idiot or a moron, though if we get really angry, we'll do that too. But we're implying that we're more intellectually sophisticated than they are. And university people are very vulnerable to thought processes that allow them to feel a bit superior that way.
So my response took me a while to really understand the way to respond to this in order to make an epistemological break with just this normalized unseeing and refusal to engage facts by saying, oh, you mean the official conspiracy theory? And that has worked very well in terms of then turning the table, so to speak, so it now becomes the onus is on the person who's brought up conspiracy theory to justify the most prominent conspiracy theory of all.
Official conspiracy theories and false flag terrorism plans remain largely unexamined by universities. After nearly 40 years, Operation Northwoods was declassified. It called for shooting innocent people on American streets, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and with the support of clandestine media, the goal was to blame it on Cuba as a pretext for war. It was proposed and signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Perhaps the most recent case that the Academy has yet to connect the dots in relation to the events of 9/11 are the anthrax attacks. Although the Bush administration and the media quickly implicated Iraq, the alleged 9/11 hijackers, or Al-Qaeda in general, investigations traced the anthrax to a U.S. bioweapons laboratory. Since blaming a Middle Eastern group had failed, the FBI then pointed their fingers at a domestic individual. However, Senator Patrick Leahy, who was giving indications of blocking the Patriot Act, became a target of the anthrax and was convinced many people were involved.
I do not believe in any way, shape, or manner that he is the only person involved in this attack on Congress and the American people. I do not believe that at all. I believe there are others involved, either as accessories before or accessories after the fact. I believe there are others who can be charged with murder.
Okay, that somehow we're not going to look at that alternative story. It's going to be forbidden. So here's where we get into taboo. It's forbidden. It is untouchable. It is unmentionable. It is dirty. It sullies you. It profanes you. It isolates you. All these things.
What normally happens in order to discredit anything that discredits the official story is that the people who raise the issue are themselves attacked.
The taboo against knowing the facts is here encoded into the identity structure itself. In the background, 9/11 justified any violation of international and constitutional law as essential to the war on terrorism.
John McMurtry, a professor of philosophy of international renown, became one of the first academics to publicly question the official story of 9/11 and presented a paper entitled, "Why is There a War in Afghanistan?" 2 months after 9/11, in which he asked the question, who benefits from the attacks? Within the next 2 days, the Wall Street Journal called him Osama McMurtry. The Globe and Fox News followed quickly with ad hominem denunciation, and his colleagues, a couple of Harvard fame, notified McMurtry that they are reporting him to the FBI and the CIA. Academics flooded his university with emails to its president and his department chair, demanding that McMurtry be fired. In the end, the university maintained McMurtry's professorship on grounds of academic freedom.
Well, I'm glad you were able to get that established, that in fact he took an enormous amount of harassment as a result of statements he made. And that, of course, has the effect on all of his colleagues, has the effect on people who think that this is a subject which demands some examination, and they begin to slide away because they see what has happened to him. Now, very luckily, he is in Canada, not in the United States, or very possibly he would be in one of the torture chambers of some Arab state. But I think that's exactly it. It's in fact the reaction is so overblown that you begin to realize that there must be something wrong here.
As a philosopher, and epistemology being one of my areas, just thinking, well, how does this happen? How do you get, because there are people who run the official conspiracy theory, and they are not part of the Bush apparatus, nor even in favor of the Bush apparatus. Why would it that they'd be identifying with this story? And indeed, often aggressively so.
Because certainly, I don't think many of us would have trouble believing that a similar kind of episode took place in another country, particularly, a less developed country, where we figure things like that happen all the time and so forth. But we tend, in other words, to see our own government, our own society as very stable, as very resistant to any kind of interior corruption. And that's what a critique of 9/11 immediately takes you there.
Well, I was president of University Ryerson, and when I was there, I had a visit from the Ryerson MP, who were asking me to cooperate with them in identifying students who might be found to be security risks. I ushered them out very quickly and suggested to them that was not my responsibility, and that they would not be receiving any reports from me on either students or faculty. It certainly made me realize the degree of cooperation that was expected.
Universities have to make uncomfortable alliances with the nation and the state. How is this situation handled? How are the universities handled?
At the University of New Hampshire in 2006, William Woodward, a professor of psychology, expressed his view in class that the Bush administration allowed the 9/11 attacks to occur. A number of students and local politicians insisted that he be fired and said there are limitations to academic freedom of speech. State legislators chimed in, demanding Woodward's dismissal and threatening to consider the issue when they next review the university's budget. Some universities, on the other hand, raised no issue. Of the hundreds of professors that began analyzing 9/11, Richard B. Lee, a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, became the first academic in North America to teach a course that critically examined 9/11.
I recall that the year was 2004, and I taught a first-year seminar on the subject of 9/11, critical perspectives on 9/11. The goal of the course was definitely to subject the official elements in the official story to the tests of evidence. Elements that were in the official report or the official version do not correspond to reality, or in some cases there were stories shown how the official narrative was shaped by excluding certain elements and including others. We built the course around the first edition of David Ray Griffin's book, The New Pearl Harbor, which was questioning the official story of 9/11. He then has done a whole series of other volumes, each one with its meticulous, even-handed prose tone, which is really important. And the students worked with that. And then their own independent researches online and in newspaper archives that the students pursued more specialized topics.
In 2008, at McMaster University, Professor of Philosophy Mark Vorobej taught an upper-level undergraduate course in argumentation theory, in which students had a strong background in philosophy and logical theory. But in his class, students devoted 5 weeks to critically examine David Ray Griffin's scholarship on 9/11. Students deconstructed each chapter with insightful critiques and were impressed by Griffin's rigor and balanced research. Towards the end of the semester, one student polled the class. The result was unanimous. Professor Vorobej noted that students trained in logic and who studied the arguments of the new Pearl Harbor carefully recognized that the official 9/11 narrative cannot survive rational scrutiny, a result that was similar to the University of Toronto class. Many of Griffin's analyses focused on the contradictions, omissions, and distortions in the 9/11 Commission's report, which has brought attention to examining the 9/11 Commission itself.
It's amazing that, as you know, any investigation of any crime or any event becomes less and less possible as time goes by.
For women who lost their husbands on 9/11, referred to as the Jersey Girls, motivated several 9/11 victim family members to compile well-researched questions regarding the failures and activities of government officials on the morning of 9/11 and called for an investigation. Despite the Bush administration's efforts to avoid any investigation for over a year, the Jersey Girls were successful in gaining media attention, which pressured the administration and led to the formation of the 9/11 Commission.
One of the reasons to be suspicious of the 9/11 Commission report is because of the executive director. This is the man who is the head of the staff who did the actual work of producing the report. He's the man who decided what topics would be pursued, what topics would not be pursued. He's the one who, we are told, outlined the document, chapter titles, subheadings, before the investigation work of the commission even began. So in other words, he framed the narrative in advance, okay? And he obviously framed it to fit with the narrative that had already been created by the FBI.
This is the executive director of the commission, Philip Zelikow. He was a close colleague of Condoleezza Rice. They had co-authored a book together. He had worked on national security with the first Bush presidency. He co-authored the national security doctrine for the Bush Jr. presidency. He was in every sense a Bush White House insider. And at the same time, he had control over which witnesses were called before the commission, what questions could be asked of them, and he had control of the final edit of the 9/11 Commission report. So that by itself should never have been allowed. And in fact, the Jersey Girls did call for his resignation when they learned about his background, but obviously nothing was done about it. We also know from Philip Sheenan's book, The Commission, that Karl Rove was in fact the principal individual. Karl Rove, Bush's senior aide, was the principal individual responsible for trying to avoid having any investigation at all. More incriminating is the fact that Zelikow remained in contact with the Bush White House, with Karl Rove specifically, while the commission was in progress, and that was explicitly not allowed by its mandate.
And he talked about, how civil liberties would have to be greatly restricted if this were to happen. Foreign policy would have to be rewritten, which in the end he did. I mean, he helped write the new defense policy. The president should be given extra powers in advance. He also published on the creation of public myth, or what he preferred to call public presumptions, stories, special big stories that touch people in a nation and draw the nation together. They may be true, they may not be true, but they dominate people's consciousness. He'd written about this before 9/11. And then he goes on and authors, in effect, the 9/11 Commission report, which is about such a traumatizing. It's just very, very strange.
The entire mandate of the 9/11 Commission is paradoxical. I'll read it directly here from page 16 of the preface. Our aim has not been to assign individual blame. Our aim has been to provide the fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11 and to identify lessons learned. So how can you claim to conduct a comprehensive investigation of 9/11 if simultaneously it's not your goal to blame anyone? What if you actually came across evidence that, that proved someone was directly involved, and what, are you going to ignore that evidence? So it begins from a paradoxical place. It also begins from a set of historical parameters that are extremely narrow. Okay, so they decide purposefully to begin with the mid-1990s or so. That's where their story begins, and they tell you about the history of Al-Qaeda. And that way they don't have to tell stories about the CIA's funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, from which Al-Qaeda is born, of course. There is a concerted effort to depict Al-Qaeda as what they call a substantial worldwide organization. So, for example, the 9/11 Commission report describes Al-Qaeda in the following way. On page 67, they write, "The inner core of Al-Qaeda continued to be a hierarchical, top-down group with defined positions, tasks, and salaries." Okay, so it sounds very much like your average corporation. However, as the former CIA executive director, Buzzy Krongard, revealed to Salon.com in 2007, Al-Qaeda, in his opinion, is, quote, an amalgamation, a loose amalgamation of people who share an antipathy to the United States and all Western values. Some of them hate each other, some of them get along, some of them are very, very small splinter groups, but it's not like IBM, with an organizational chart, with black lines and chains of command and things like that. So there you have someone from the inside of the national security state in the United States contradicting quite explicitly what the 9/11 Commission report tells us. Others, academics, have sort of reiterated this. Professor Andrew Silke, for example, the director of terrorism studies at the University of East London, has said, and I'll quote directly again, "To begin with, Al-Qaeda is not a traditional terrorist organization. It does not have a clear hierarchy, military mindset, and centralized command. At best, Al-Qaeda is a network of affiliated groups sharing religious and ideological backgrounds, but which often interact sparingly." So why, I guess we have to ask, would the 9/11 Commission go to such great lengths to portray Al-Qaeda as this worldwide organization in dozens of countries with salaried positions, when top intelligence experts and top academics in the field of terrorism studies tell us that, in fact, the opposite is true?
Part of how the legal system in the West works is that generally, this isn't true for all countries, but the basic system used, say, in England, the United States, and Canada, is an adversarial system. You have the prosecutor, you have the defense, and they tell competing narratives. They give different explanations of what happened. The people who are accused, in other words, have a voice, they have an advocate. They are supposed to be presumed innocent. And of course, 9/11 Commission does not even attempt to replicate a legal procedure. And most importantly, just like the Warren Commission, as Russell pointed out, there is no spokesperson for the accused. There's nobody who's appointed to represent Al-Qaeda or to tell their point of view or to explain where bin Laden was or what he was doing or any of that. So in effect, we get a monologue. We hear only one voice throughout the whole document, and it's all pushing one story. All anomalies, all difficulties can be put to one side. The whole point of the idea of competing parties an adversarial system, is that hopefully in that debate and the rough and tumble, the truth will emerge. How is the truth going to emerge in a monologue? A monologue told by people who were very close to the U.S. government. People like the executive director, Philip Zelikow.
I think one way in which the media contribute to this notion of Al-Qaeda as this worldwide organization that threatens the American way of life is by using Al-Qaeda in connection with just about every terrorist incident that happens anywhere. So when journalists use phrases such as inspired by Al-Qaeda, this attack was either inspired by, or the group that committed the attack was linked to Al-Qaeda. What exactly does that mean? It's not clear. Is this some kind of ideological affinity that they have? If, as Buzzy Krongard says, you only have to have an antipathy toward the United States to be considered part of Al-Qaeda, well, then half the planet could fit that description. An example in the 9/11 Commission report of the exaggeration of Al-Qaeda's capacity. There are many such examples, but one example I'll point to is on page 180, in which the Commission writes, "The terrorist plots that were broken up at the end of 1999 display the variety of operations that might be attributed, however indirectly, to Al-Qaeda." And I think, that's an indicative phrase, however indirectly. It basically says, we're beyond the sort of, trying to connect Kevin Bacon to other actors here. We're basically saying this Al-Qaeda is this amorphous thing that we can apply in almost any circumstance. So I think we need a better definition of it. Otherwise, it only contributes to the expansion of this so-called war on terror. I think the most common reason given by average people of why they believe Al-Qaeda is behind 9/11 is the confession video that was released in December 2001. In relation to that, there was the admission. The Washington Post published a story in which they revealed that the CIA had actually prepared a fake tape of Osama bin Laden and his alleged followers, and the idea of the tape was to portray bin Laden as a pedophile. And they had done a similar project. They were actually working on a similar project to spread a tape about Saddam Hussein and to try to discredit him in the Arab world. So we actually have admission from the CIA that they have created a fake tape of Osama bin Laden. Now that doesn't prove that the confession video is, of the same kind of fakery, but certainly it shows some kind of intent was there.
So we're reading the 9/11 Commission report, and we find a footnote. There's a forest of footnotes. This is why it looks like scholarship. It's big and heavy. It's got little print. It's got a lot of footnotes, and they're in even smaller print. So it's made to look like an academic work. So you say, well, that's interesting.
One study revealed that 25% of the footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report are based on tortured testimony. It's even more condensed when you consider that most of that tortured testimony belongs to chapters 5 and 7 of the report, which deal with the alleged Al-Qaeda plot. On page 146 of the 9/11 Commission report, the commissioners admit that they were not allowed to meet with the alleged Al-Qaeda detainees. They were not allowed to submit questions to the detainees. They were not even allowed to submit questions to the alleged interrogators. they were told that it would interrupt the interrogation process, a process which we now know had consisted of 183 waterboardings in 1 month.
They even admit, they give one little part of the page in which they say, well, you know, a lot of it we've based on here is from people held in detention. We can't be sure that this is accurate. We weren't allowed to interview them or talk to these detainees. Weren't even allowed to talk to the people who interrogated them. So it's kind of secondhand, but we decided, you know, to go ahead. They didn't just go ahead. They made it the core of their story. And they don't discuss there the fact that these guys were tortured. In the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, something like 190 times he was waterboarded, or that he was told his son might be killed, you know, and all these kinds of things. He later told the ICRC, the Red Cross, that he'd made stuff up. Well, of course you'd make stuff up. They don't discuss that. They don't discuss the moral implications, the epistemological implications. What does it mean to base a story on that kind of testimony? It's absurd.
In the days leading up to 9/11, there was unusual market activity indicating possible foreknowledge of the attacks that later entered into the peer-reviewed literature. With regard to the stocks of the very airliners that crashed into the towers, the Commission stated in a single footnote that it was highly suspicious trading on its face. However, they dismissed it by stating that the individual involved had no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda. Paul Zaremka, an econometrician and editor of Frontiers in Econometrics, has been concerned about the lack of discussion regarding academic studies critically examining this topic.
First of all, you shouldn't even be presuming that Al-Qaeda did it. I mean, if you're doing some kind of investigation of how it happened, you don't presume anything. Now, what happened on the data on American Airlines and United Airlines are that both stocks, coincidentally, were around $32 a week before 9/11. And then afterwards, the stocks fell from around 30 to around 18 when the stock market opened 1 week later. So obviously you can make a lot of money if you had a put option on either American Airlines or United Airlines, okay? That's just the data. That's just how things work, okay? The question then becomes whether there was an unusual level of movements in put options in either of those stocks before 9/11. The put option is one of several methods that you can take advantage of, knowing something that's going to happen to a stock price before it happens, anticipating that it's going to happen, and if it does happen in the direction you expect it to happen, then you can make a lot of money. When I say that you can buy a put option to be able to sell a stock later, you're buying the option to sell. You're not selling, you're buying the option to sell, okay? But if I have bought the option to sell, I can also sell my option to sell, okay? So the normal data that you get in publications adds those two together. And then they look at a ratio of that total quantity to another thing which is called a call option, which is the opposite of being able to sell a stock. It's the option of being able to buy a stock. That gives you a put-call ratio. That's publicly available. Professor Podosman is from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and he was given confidential data by the Chicago Board of Options Exchange to investigate the issue about whether there was insider trading on American Airlines and United Airlines stocks before 9/11. When I say confidential data, I mean he was actually given exact transactions, which I'm going to argue is significant because the public data are not that detailed. Then he made an analysis on put options which occurred in these two airlines, and he focused on the days before 9/11 up to 9/11 itself. But Podosman was able to look at the individual call and put options and distinguish that which was a sale from that which was a purchase. So in other words, he had clean data the rest of us can't really get a hold of. And from that data, he then made an analysis of was the pattern, the levels in which there was selling of put options, or excuse me, buying of put options, was the level of the buying of put options extraordinary in the days before 9/11 or not? And that's a statistical question of which there is no 100% answer. I mean, any statistical question is a probabilistic statement. His final conclusion is that with probability around 99%, there was insider trading on American Airlines and United Airlines. It was published in the Journal of Business. The Journal of Business is a peer-reviewed journal in which if they get any article, they have to send it out for review from other scholars in the fields. It obviously is a very mainstream publication, whatever you want to call it, business school publication. So it's an outstanding place for such a publication to have appeared. But what's amazing is that I've never seen an analysis afterwards, and now we're more than 4 years later. I still have yet to see anybody counter his work, and yet it's extremely important work. I mean, you would think. I mean, I have been an econometrician. I know how this work is done. If you publish anything that's particularly interesting, some other people are going to make other articles from a contrary point of view, or criticize your data or methodology or something like that. For example, if you do a study of what is the cause of crime, or you're doing a study of does capital punishment increase or decrease the probability of crime, well, you've got a lot of people in those articles, and they have to take different positions, and some of them are extremely critical of the other one. In this particular case, this is really, this is deaths of 3,000 people, and nobody's contesting his results, which it may mean that they're unobjectionable, but I don't believe that. I think it's more that people are scared to even discuss it. I don't know. It's remarkable to me that normal business school or econometrician, faculty members in departments of economics haven't gone after the paper. It's almost like they prefer to ignore it than to discuss it.
In addition to the humanities and social sciences, the civil engineering community also adopted the official story and maintained critical perspectives generally outside their discourse. Zdeněk Bezant, an eminent professor of civil engineering at Northwestern University, within just hours of the attacks, worked out an entire explanation arguing that the towers were doomed to collapse, and submitted it to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics on September 13th, just 2 days after 9/11. To explain the entire collapse in the context of a lack of physical and visual evidence, Bezant argued that when the supporting columns failed, or buckled, the upper portion of roughly a dozen stories above the aircraft impact remained rigid as they pulverized some 80 stories below it, and then it pulverized itself. Without referring to the actual sizes or strengths of the columns in the towers, and without specifying whether columns were open sections or closed box columns, Bezant proposed his own theoretical model of a steel column in the towers, a 3-hinge bending model. He assumed that his model provided the greatest resistance because it dissipates or absorbs the kinetic energy of the falling upper portion of the tower into 3 different bending regions of each column. Along with several other assumptions, he concluded that his work is the definitive explanation, as his calculations are consistent with the towers coming down within 10 to 12 seconds. Although many engineers have argued from a strictly physics point of view that such an explanation is incorrect, Bezant maintained in his subsequent papers that all critics of his explanation are outside the community of structural engineering.
I believe that in certain circles, let's say civil engineering or structural engineering, it is a taboo. And there is some kind of understanding that you are going to be, you are going to lose all your credentials to respectability.
We have full-scale testing equipment for a variety of structural systems, including columns, beams, frames. We do a lot of that kind of research in civil engineering. Up until the time of the 9/11 collapses, we made efforts to make sure that our structures had an adequate safety factor and had a robustness, built-in redundancy. In other words, if a particular element within a structure failed, it wouldn't mean that the entire structure would fail. And we were able to succeed in that direction, I guess, until 9/11. And suddenly the world changed as far as structural engineering is concerned. For Towers 1 and 2, Professor Bazant from Northwestern proposed the simplified model, which I take issue with in terms of its ability to predict the amount of energy dissipated when one story comes crashing down on another story. Tested 11 tubes with different sizes and thicknesses and different lengths to try to establish the effect of slenderness ratio, which is the degree to which a column is subject to buckling or not.
Since the core and perimeter in Towers 1 and 2 were box columns, Kroll believes that they were not very slender. The columns would not only bend, as Bazant maintains, but they would also tend to crush, which would significantly dissipate much of the energy of the falling upper stories.
Square tubes, such as what I'm holding here, subject to axial compression, to just see what happens when indeed we do crush it a good percentage of the story height. And that's what we've endeavored to do here. And of course we found that we get a much higher resistance over the period of the travel of the crosshead of the testing machine than if we simply had a plastic hinge develop in the middle.
In the past, Professors Tomasz Wierzbicki and Lodek Abrahamowicz derived a formula describing the resistance offered by columns being crushed when they were studying Ford automobile crash tests. To further this research, Professor Kroll's team found that crushing offers 6 times more resistance than the 3-hinge bending model. These resistances were then applied into a multi-story building model to see if the entire model would collapse if an entire story was removed.
Even with the Wierzbicki formula that reduces the assumed resistance by 50%, we're finding that for the computer runs that we've done, very few result in complete collapse. And if now we modify our model based on these tests that I've been describing, I'm quite certain that we'll find that none of our buildings will collapse. And the next stage then is to move to building 7.
If you were to go to the common man or woman and ask them about building 7, I don't think you will find enough people who know what building 7. If you were to go ahead just a little bit and tell them, wait a minute, there's a building that collapsed mysteriously on that day, many hours after the planes hit the 2 towers, I don't think people are aware of that. Okay, those who were made aware of it from my basic knowledge are extremely disturbed when they learn that there's a building that collapsed.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, funded by the U.S. Department of Commerce, was mandated by Congress to explain the collapse of the World Trade Center Tower buildings and World Trade Center Building 7. It was a 47-story steel-framed building consisting of New York City's Emergency Command Center and the second-largest CIA office. Building 7 was not hit by a plane. And NIST concluded that office fires, initiated by the debris from the falling towers, would be the first time in history fires brought down a steel-framed high-rise building.
When you look at the Beijing hotel fire, the Mandarin Hotel was full of fireworks for distribution worldwide, caught on fire, and we ended up with an inferno of that building, and it stood it. It didn't collapse. So the question is, why did the Beijing fire not result in a global collapse of that structure, whereas in the case of 7, it did?
Based entirely on a computer model, NIST concluded that the fires caused a particular beam to thermally expand, kicking the girder of a column off its seat, leaving it unsupported, which caused it to buckle.
Those academics whose work relate to 9/11 matters, I think they have a role to play, especially engineers. Because the 9/11 story that the government has advocated is based on engineering flaws.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. Well, if evidence is removed, no scientist can possibly reconstruct what happened. A scientist has no better friend than valid critics to whom they respond. And if the criticisms lead to abandonment of the hypothesis because it doesn't fit, because the facts don't fit the idea, then the hypothesis must be abandoned and replaced with something more adequate.
Upon being corrected by a high school physics teacher, NIST admitted in their final report that Building 7 came down in free fall acceleration for over 100 feet, encountering zero resistance in that period of time.
And in the 10-story analysis structure that I and 2 co-authors have put together, we clearly show that there is sawtooth action when you remove all of the columns in any story above the bottom one. You're going to get the conservational momentum principle applies, and it's going to slow down the velocity, and that seemingly doesn't appear to be the case from what we've witnessed. So why are we having a conflict between Newtonian physics and observation? And I think that's an open question that more people ought to be probing into.
Despite its mandate to provide the fullest account of 9/11, the 571-page commission report did not mention Building 7, except in a little footnote. Across the entire spectrum of the events of 9/11, evidence has been in the process of being destroyed or withheld. Many of the tapes which had testimony from torture which were crucial to the 9/11 story were destroyed by the CIA. Despite an agreement between the Security and Exchange Commission to keep all of its records, the data regarding put options in the days leading up to 9/11 have been destroyed. In response to a civil engineer trying to verify NIST's work, they stated that all files of Building 7's global collapse computer model have been classified because it is a national security issue.
It's regarded as so explosive in that issue. The proofs, the so-called proofs for it, were so badly presented by the administration back several years ago that a great many questions have arisen, and none of them have been answered. And yet here we are, still engaged in wars, which flow straight right from 9/11 and what happened on that day.
I thought it was very important to communicate to the public what they may not know, and certainly nobody was talking about it, that under international law this was a supreme crime. which is a war of aggression, invasion of another country. That is the supreme law of international law, the supreme crime under which all the other crimes follow. I mean, that's already established international law. So I just put that out to normal places that normally had published my correspondence and just said, are people aware of that? No one would publish that. And all I did was quote the international law word for word. Nobody. Well, during that period, somebody got in touch with me and said, we want to have you debate somebody from the U.S. on this.
McMurtry was asked to debate Thomas Donnelly, who had been an executive of the think tank Project for a New American Century, which consisted of neoconservatives such as Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Wolfowitz. A year before 9/11, Donnelly was the principal author of the think tank's defining document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, which called for defense spending to be raised to $100 billion, and advocated full-spectrum dominance, to deny others the use of outer space, and to preemptively take actions. But for all this to happen, it would take far too long unless there was a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
In Washington, we're joined by Thomas Donnelly, an expert on U.S. foreign policy and defense. He's with the American Enterprise Institute. Donnelly says the U.S. has a great responsibility to protect freedom around the world, and he disagrees with those who say Bush is the bigger threat. And with us here in studio is John McMurtry. He's an author and philosophy professor at the University of Guelph. He says Bush's policies are the biggest threat to world peace, and that they constitute a war crime. You have written about the U.S. threat to peace. Do you believe that the United States is more of a threat to peace than Saddam Hussein?
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, the biggest threat to me is, Saddam Hussein, you must remember, was very much supported by the U.S. in the 80s, and indeed his coup d'etat was favored by the U.S., and his worst crimes were done with U.S. support, and many of his arms were imported from Britain and the U.S. But the concern I have is not to wind it back to who's responsible for Saddam Hussein, but rather what is happening to the Iraqi people. And we have, with the U.S. proceeding to go unilaterally in announcing its intention to wage war, it is already in violation of the Nuremberg Charter. A war crime begins with the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war in violation of international treaties, agreements, or insurance. In fact, there's impeachment proceedings, articles being drawn up in the United States for also violating the U.S. War Crimes Act, and we also have such a War Crimes Act here. Thomas is advocating war crime here. I suppose he would be, in this sense, subject to the application of the law there as well.
War crimes because they're invading another country?
Yes, without validation by the Security Council of the United Nations and in violation of international law. And then the war crime is already in place when you start to move outside, and they have announced very clearly their intention to move with or without the UN, and that is a war crime to proceed to do, to wage, to prepare and plan for war. And Mr. Donnelly's recent article, he said planning for war. He himself is advocating a war crime.
Are you advocating war crime, Mr. Donnelly?
Look, that past statement was so morally, politically, legally perverse that I have to raise objection to it. Look, let's begin with the legal argument. Surely UN Resolution 1441 already provides the basis for taking military action against Iraq.
You are advocating the planning and preparation for war against Iraq without any international legitimation by the Security Council. So you are now advocating a war crime.
Well, obviously we're not having much of a dialogue here. Well, I don't know what serious consequences was understood by the diplomatic community to mean other than that there would be military action taken to enforce Resolution 1441, and also to enforce the previous 16 resolutions.
This is a complete non sequitur. It does not follow from 1441. This has been declared by including the Secretary General. It is, you see, there's a presupposition here that God is America, and America makes these judgments, or its president makes these judgments, independent of international law. And that you have, it's not just international law, the War Crimes Court, the International Criminal Court, you refuse to sign on for it. You refuse to sign on for the legislation against crimes against humanity and war crimes. You refuse to sign on, and indeed have sabotaged conventions on chemical and biological weapons, on the ABM Treaty, on Kyoto Protocol,
okay, so let's
and on you go. You are a rogue administration.
Okay,
you are the biggest danger.
Okay, so I'm going to give Thomas Donnelly a final word on that. So that's Mr. McMurtry's case. Give us a final word.
Also, well, look, I would like to conclude by saying that the use of American power in the world has been, as a matter of practical and historical fact, the sole reliable instruments, first of all, for bringing peace and stability and freedom to the European continent. Secondly, we hope now to do the same sort of thing in Iraq.
And the person who invited me to do it is bureaucratically removed. Well, the unspeakable is again something I've written about academically in a logic journal. You know, a ruling structure of fallacy, I call it. What it is you never discuss anything that is in conflict with the basic ruling structure of society. So, for example, you don't talk in the United States. You wouldn't talk about, say, the international crime, war crime of the U.S., because that would be going against the basic ruling structure of that society. So it was unspeakable, and you don't even now hear those words being used.
In 1991, Wolfowitz told General Wesley Clark that they had to attack the Middle East between the years of approximately 1996 to 2001, before the next superpower challenges the United States. In the weeks right after 9/11, General Clark was shocked to learn that those plans were now in effect.
I went downstairs, I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. And I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this, I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened.
And yet, the universities are sleeping so soundly you could hear the snoring from outer space. You see my point? Think of the thousands of people that are involved here. Think about the university's self-image. This is a place where intelligence flourishes. This is like a temple to the mind. Huge research libraries, thousands of professors, working away, gathering knowledge, information, critical analysis, postmodern, this and that. Really proud of their critical faculties. Hundreds of thousands of students working away, smart young people. How on earth could a group of people, and these are people for whom universities generally have contempt, people associated with the Bush administration, widely derided, made fun of by academics, how would they fool the universities? See, I think this is so interesting and important that it's worth thinking about in its own right. Now, of course, we know there are dissidents within universities, and the number is growing. But when you think about the potential power of universities, it's not a formal political power, an informal power that comes through credibility, high status in society, and influence. They could be stopping this whole thing in its tracks, but they're not.
The real facts behind 9/11 are the linchpin of the 21st century, because the entire narrative has been built on the premise that there are implacable enemies of the United States and of the West who will stop at nothing to do heinous crimes, and so that will justify erosion of civil liberties, that will justify unlimited allocation for defense spending, and that will limit securities, pat-downs in airports of 80-year-old grandmothers are getting patted down in the airports. It's all justified in terms of this pivotal event. And, of course, there's a lot of security billions invested in maintaining that story. And so I think that the task of universities and university professors has to be relentlessly questioning that story and any other story that doesn't stand the smell test and that seems to support who benefits from these things. It's not the people of Iraq or the people of Afghanistan who are being pounded to bits, but it certainly is the large defense establishment, the military forces that are benefiting because they have a new enemy. And so that, I think, is an absolutely crucial task that academics should undertake.
So that's what our aim is, to ensure that the public is aware that this kind of investigation is needed. And we're prepared to do our part in this regard.